Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 216, May 1865. Last week, we talked about the surrender at Bennett's Place. Johnson has officially capitulated with his army and those in his district, leaving not many remaining options for Jefferson Davis. This week, we will discuss Davis and the other surrenders of the war. We will also talk about the CSS Shenandoah with a first-hand account of her voyage. First, though, we will talk about what is considered to be the last battle of the war, Palmetto Ranch. Before we get into that, though, let's talk about some Patreon content, and of course, here as we get into the end of the war, it's hard to believe we really only have 2 episodes left of our main narrative. We're going to be continuing with some Patreon content. And of course, here in May, I think this one's a little bit of a stretch. There is some Civil War themes in it, but I'm going back to movies, and I'm going to be watching Major Dundee, Charlton Heston, in that movie. And there is a north-south element and also Mexico. And I think it actually kind of ties fairly nicely with Palmetto Ranch, here being the last battle of the war fought there in southern Texas. So I'm going to be reviewing that one. Not going to lie, though, everyone, I think this is more of a watch for me, right? I do enjoy that movie, so but there is some Civil War themes in there. So we'll be going back to the well of the movie reviews. There's still a couple that we actually haven't got to, so that will be further down the pike here as we keep moving forward. So if that sounds like it would interest you, there's some other movie reviews that we've done before, some memoir reviews. There's some more of those that are slated here. Picture slideshows as well, showing the modern day battlefields, what they look like. If any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description to the Patreon, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. Now we're going to jump around a little bit in this episode in terms of dates, because it flows better, I believe. But the last skirmish of the Civil War is going to be fought in Texas on May 12th at a place called Palmetto Ranch. Now, it's been some time since we've been in Texas. Operations were quiet down in that sector since we had Nathaniel Banks and his invasion capturing Brownsville. Now, this action is actually fairly overshadowed by the Red River campaign. If you remember, there was a conflict in objectives, an invasion of Texas versus the Red River Valley. In this sector of the war, there's kind of a shift in terms of objectives, right? You had Nathaniel Banks, he had some successful operations so far, at least around New Orleans, Louisiana, and then Ulysses S. Grant kind of takes the reins, and he wants to kind of shift the focus away from this sector of the war. It's not really particularly strategically important, or is all that much important, right? Lincoln would like to have a strong presence there in Texas because of the French and how they had their intervention into Mexico. So he wants to have that. We want to try to eliminate the Trans-Mississippi. Kirby Smith is still out here on this island, especially after Vicksburg. There's not really going to be a whole lot of things for them to do. So this campaign, in some ways, is sort of a waste. And it could have been a huge disaster had Kirby Smith been able to capitalize on capturing a large portion of Nathaniel Banks' army, because all of those troops actually get shifted, as we know, back to the Eastern Theater, so they are able to participate not only in the Overland Campaign, but also in Sheridan's Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864. So if we had all these troops that maybe had to be paroled, maybe they were captured or otherwise eliminated, became casualties on the battlefield, then yeah, that could have been a huge problem. So there's always kind of this conflict of interest here in this theater. As a result of this, as a result of Ulysses S. Grant taking control of the operations, obviously he wants more of a strike on Mobile, and we have already talked about Sherman, what he's doing and whatnot. We do see the federal troops being fairly stagnant here in this region since we talked about those invasions, since we talked about Brownsville all the way back in previous episodes. With Lee now surrendered, as well as Johnson, we will see Kirby Smith begin to have negotiations. Lew Wallace and John Pope would both originally wish to give Smith the same terms that Grant had given to Lee, but they were rejected. At least at that point, Smith still had a good control west of the Mississippi, and the Confederate government had yet to be disbanded. While these negotiations were going on, we will have what is considered to be the last battle of the Civil War. At Santiago Brazos, there would be a regiment of Indiana volunteers and 2 United States colored regiments, the 62nd and 87th. Originally, this brigade was commanded by an Indiana veteran of Vicksburg, the 34th being comprised of all veteran troops who had their enlistments expire. Well, this commander would resign, leaving command to Colonel Theodore Barrett. Barrett had been an officer of the 62nd, but he had not seen any combat. He would move his brigade toward the Confederates in May for unknown reasons. Some believe he wanted to see his share of combat before the war was over. There might have been a need to capture some horses or otherwise perform a reconnaissance in force. Included in the federal forces would be U.S. Texas cavalry, some of which made up of Texans of Mexican descent. They would see some success in capturing some prisoners, driving the rebels away from their camps, but a counterattack would push them back. John Rip Ford was the commander of the Confederate forces. Ford was a Texas Ranger who would go on to become mayor of Brownsville. He would have artillery, maybe provided or captured from the French forces still occupying Mexico. Ford would flank the Federals as they skirmished with advance elements using artillery to great effect. He would make sure that the Northern troops could not form a rally with these weapons. A portion of the Federals would be pressed toward the Rio Grande and captured. With both sides resuming the unofficial truce, the last skirmish of the war is considered a Confederate victory. Some 100 Union troops were captured, with casualties figures debated. Some estimates say that there were as many as 30 Federal deaths, some of which were caused by drowning in the Rio Grande or by French intervention into the combat. Private John Williams, who served in the 34th Indiana, is considered to be the last fatality of the Civil War. So we need to tie up a few loose ends as well, one of which is Jefferson Davis. The Confederate president, of course, was hoping even after Lee's surrender that the southern states could still have hope. We mentioned how Johnson might have been able to prolong the war, but his army would be withering away to just few in numbers, and the Union forces were still quite strong. With his beginning of negotiations, the writing was on the wall for Davis. Now, you could also say that Kirby Smith is in the Trans-Mississippi, but we've already pretty well highlighted that he's kind of on an island, and he really can't provide any sort of support for the rest of the Confederacy. That's kind of the big conundrum, especially after Vicksburg falls, is that there's really no way of shipping any troops from, say, Arkansas, Louisiana, over to where they're needed in, say, the Eastern Theater or even in the sub-theater of the war, right? They're just not going to be willing to go. There's so many accounts that we have of troops who kind of lose their will to sort of fight abroad. Mississippi, certainly when you have all the setbacks in that state, you had the capture of Little Rock in Arkansas. Obviously, New Orleans had fallen. So all these states have seen their home territory be victimized by Federals, and that kind of saps the will out of you to go and fight abroad, even though the strategic situation might have called for that. So Kirby Smith does a good job of keeping these forces together. They're not going to be crossing the Mississippi anytime soon, so obviously that leaves very little in terms of options for Jefferson Davis. His goal is going to be to trek through the Carolinas and down into Georgia. Forrest is still operating in Alabama, but he would be getting ready to surrender his forces on May 9th. On the 5th, Dabney Maury, commanding in the district, would surrender. Other capitulations were popping up all throughout the southern states. Mosby and McNeil would both surrender, surprisingly with the potential threat of maybe being tried, both of their commands partisan rangers. Lumped in with guerrillas, the Union troops were not too kind to captured irregulars, as we have highlighted in John Kassler's account on our Patreon. Mosby, who we also talked about in the Patreon, would make sure his troopers would not be executed or otherwise harmed before he was willing to surrender. Remember that there was still speculation about who was responsible for Lincoln's assassination. Mosby, who had been the scourge of federal operations in Northern Virginia, would be a primary suspect. We also talked about how Mosby is part of an operation to get members of the Confederate Torpedo Bureau into Washington. They never really make it there, right? But at least that was the hope, that they would get into Washington and actually blow up the White House. So there is that. There's some merit in these accusations, and that Mosby was responsible for having to get these men into Washington. They never make it that far. Obviously, it's one of the crack brain schemes that you have from the Confederates when they're kind of just throwing things at the wall, seeing if something sticks. Well, that's going to lead us to Davis. Jefferson Davis had two of these things on his mind as the goal of keeping the Confederacy alive switched to escaping the country entirely. For one, he was considered to be fully responsible for the death of Lincoln, and while he did not explicitly order it, there were Confederate agents comprising the operation. Remember, we talked about John Harrison Surratt and his involvement, and the questionable involvement that he might have had more of a hand in the potential kidnapping of Abraham Lincoln than he did in the assassination. We have conflicting resources saying he was in Washington, he was in Elmira, New York. He actually escapes the country, and of course, he actually escapes execution as well, one of the conspirators to do that. I think this concept, though, of execution just in general, we haven't really talked about in quite some time. I think really the first time we sort of threw it out there maybe was in 1862 when we talked about Fort Donelson, and we talked about how there were generals in the Confederate Army who had previously served in the United States government, and how they were fearing being captured because if they were taken prisoner, there's the likelihood that they might be executed. Well, that hasn't really been the case for some time, right? But certainly if you're Jefferson Davis, you have to be thinking like, well, I think I'm in a little bit of a different category than the rest of these generals, right? Robert E. Lee, nothing bad is happening to him. Of course, he was just serving in the army, but I was the head of the government, right? And there were some of these things, questionable things that happened. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln being kind of the ultimate case that were happening under my watch. And there's a lot of people who are mad at the war and how it went, and there's a lot of casualties. A lot of people died. So even though I wasn't the one to start the war, right, I think that we can also kind of throw that out there and sort of understand it from Jefferson Davis's perspective, in that he didn't start the war. He was sort of elected president, right? Like, he didn't necessarily campaign for that. But especially with the new government, Abraham Lincoln is one thing, but you have this new government that Johnson is going to be the president. He's kind of an unknown factor here. You have Edwin Stanton, who's still operating. Edwin Stanton has been very pounding the table for the execution of individuals. We have to try these people for treason. And if you're going to take anyone into a trial for treason and then probably find them guilty and then ultimately wind up on the gallows, it's probably going to be the Confederate president. Now, we know that in the end of the war, there's really only two executions as a result of the Civil War. One being Henry Wirz, who is going to be the commander, the commandant there at Andersonville. And obviously we have a pretty interesting case in his regard where he says, I really didn't have a whole lot to operate off of. And obviously there were a lot of terrible conditions in Civil War camps in general. So he kind of becomes the figurehead for that. And Andersonville, of course, we talked about that before, how there's just a huge amount of prisoner deaths there due to the poor conditions. So he's kind of paying the price for that. And then you have Champ Ferguson as well, whose commission into the Confederate Army is questionable. I have seen it where maybe he actually wasn't part of the Confederate Army. He was just operating as an irregular. Well, he does some pretty terrible things in Kentucky. There's a lot of killings and then reprisals for the killings. We've talked about him before. Obviously, we had recently an example at First Saltville, where he's executing prisoners and he's finding individuals who are serving in the Union Army from areas from which he's from there in Tennessee, and he's executing them. So we have two examples of executions that are going to be popping up here at the end of the war, and Davis does not want to be part of them. No, the decision was going to be made for Jefferson Davis to attempt to flee the country. Ironically, the former president had been content to let Confederate leaders and personnel leave. Famously, he would comment prior to his assassination that there was no harm in letting them leave, in a way removing sort of these rotten apples from the bunch, so to speak. But now Lincoln was dead, and there were those like Edwin Stanton, as we have talked about, who would wish to apprehend the Southerners rather than let them off the hook. Davis would dissolve the government in early May, moving through Georgia. His party would be surrounded on May 9th by troopers from the 4th Michigan and 1st Wisconsin. Unfortunately for the Union cavalry, neither would be aware of the other and opened fire. The shooting would alert Davis, who attempted to flee, throwing on his wife's overcoat. A trooper was able to apprehend him, however, Jefferson Davis making his way eventually to Fortress Monroe, where he would be imprisoned. The fact that he grabs this overcoat is actually where you get the myth that he was disguised as a woman, and obviously you have some of these contemporary sources who are going to take advantage of that in an effort to discredit him, right, to humiliate him as well. The remainder of the Confederate forces would start to surrender across the South. May 12th would mark the last surrender east of the Mississippi River. Kirby Smith would surrender the Trans-Mississippi on June 2nd. Stan Waddy would become the last general to surrender, not turning himself in until late June. May 26th is generally considered to be the date that the war is officially over. So, while we have talked about how the Army units are surrendering, there would be one Confederate naval vessel, a privateer, who famously would not surrender until November of 1865. This would be the CSS Shenandoah, and we're going to end today's episode by talking about her journey and the conclusion. And we're actually going to be jumping here in progress. Hopefully you get an idea of what it was sort of like to be out there as a Confederate raider. And then you have, of course, this end of the raid. Late in the afternoon of the 29th of December, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, we very unexpectedly captured the bark Delphine of Bangor, Maine. The gale of the previous few days had scarcely abated, and the sea was running very high, when the Delphine came astern to us. We were under reefed topsails, with propeller up and fires out, and the bark was under a good press of canvas, and to the windward of us, so that they were very much afraid she would give us the slip before we could make sail. But the captain of the Delphine had no suspicions, taking us for an Englishman, and ran close up to us for the purpose of exchanging signals. The Shenandoah was then hauled close up to the wind, and the bark passed under our stern, leading us to the windward. We at once fired a blank cartridge from one of our little guns. The Delphine at first paid little attention to this, but kept her sails full, and gained on us rapidly. We then cleared away the 2 forward guns, and prepared to give her a rifle shot, but before we were ready for this, she hauled up her mainsail and hove to. Captain Nichols of the Delphine was of course greatly chagrined at the manner in which he had been caught, and when informed that his vessel was to be destroyed, he declared that his wife, whom he had with him, was a delicate and nervous woman, and that it would be as much of her life was worth to bring her from one ship to the other in such rough weather. Captain Nichols pleaded so earnestly that Captain Waddell was very much moved, and thought seriously of letting the bark go under bonds. At this juncture, the first lieutenant suggested that the surgeon be sent off to see Mrs. Nichols. Dr. Lining, upon his return, reported that she was a person of robust health and strong nerves, and that there was not the slightest cause for apprehension on her account. We had taken 2 stanch whaleboats from the Edward, and these were found very useful in transferring the crew of the Delphine in the very high sea that was running. We brought all hands off safely, hoisting Mrs. Nichols and the stewardess on board in a boatswain's chair, but it was very nearly midnight before we got the bark on fire and resumed our course. The prisoners from the Delphine remained with us until we reached Australia. Captain Nichols and his wife were taken into the wardroom mess and were given quarters in the starboard cabin. Mrs. Nichols was a handsome woman, and after the first few days, she was quite gracious, and would sit in the wardroom, chat with the officers, and play checkers and backgammon with us. Captain Nichols, however, was very melancholy, and refused to be comforted. One of the officers endeavored to rally him by saying, "Now, Captain, Just suppose that on the morning of the day you came up with us, you had altered your course only a quarter of a point. We should not have seen you, and you would never have been captured." Captain Nichols turned on him with a grim smile and retorted, "That shows how much you know about it. That is just what troubles me. I did alter my course that very morning, exactly a quarter of a point, and that was the only reason I was captured." On January 25th, 1865, we made the land of Australia. About noon, we took on board a pilot. In the afternoon of the same day, we were safely anchored in Hobson's Bay, the port of Melbourne. We had expected to spend only a few days here, but the week of steaming just before reaching port, with the damage to our shaft sustained in the South Atlantic and imperfectly repaired, had been productive of serious results. A diver who was sent down to examine the stern bearing reported the injury so great that it would be necessary to dock the vessel in order to make the necessary repairs. Thus, our stay in Melbourne became a matter of weeks instead of days. On the morning of February 18th, we weighed anchor and went to sea. Our crew of 30-odd men had suffered somewhat from desertions at Melbourne, so that we were still deplorably short-handed. And although we had applications enough to man our ship twice over, we were compelled to decline all overtures to enlist men while in British waters. When the ship was fairly outside of English jurisdiction, however, it soon became known that there were a number of strangers on board, and when these stowaways were mustered on deck, they numbered 42, about twice the number of our own crew, men of all nations, kindred, and tongues. Among them was the captain of an English steamer lying in Melbourne when we left, who had thrown up his command to come on board with us, and was made captain's clerk. So we have an interesting first couple of descriptions here of the raid here, and I know we're kind of joining in progress here, but we have this account of what it was actually like to capture a whaler or otherwise some kind of merchant vessel that was a northern vessel. So we have the crew coming on board, and you're destroying the ship. You're taking whatever valuables you can take, and it's fairly civil. We talked about how at this point in naval warfare, there's a lot of rules. There's a lot of these kind of things that you follow, and in many ways, it's actually a little bit more genteel than your land war is. So certainly if you're a raider, you're giving them every opportunity to just go ahead and surrender. There's no need to waste any lives or ammunition or anything on this. Let's just go ahead and call it right here. And that's usually what happens with these raiders. And then we have another account here of the crew being taken on board. We know that a lot of these Confederate naval vessels, they're getting crew from abroad, right? We talked about how the Alabama had a large portion of her crew being English, right? So we have other individuals who are trying to come on board and join this venture here from Australia. And the motivations are actually going to be differing, right? You're either sympathetic to the Confederacy, right? Or maybe in this instance, you're more or less wanting to join a raider because you want to take part in the prize captures that are going on, right? So it's more of an opportunistic hire. On the 21st day of June, we entered Bering Sea and crossed the 180th meridian of longitude. The sight of the large pieces of fat lean, or whale meat, floating in the water warned us that whalers were at work nearby, and very soon after we came upon several. The week which followed was the busiest of the cruise. Not a day passed without our making one or more captures. In all, we took 25 whale ships, which, with the exception of 3 or 4, were burned. Some disposition had to be made of the prisoners, and we could not put them ashore in those frozen regions. We were obliged to bond one vessel in every 6 or 7 in order to dispose of the crews in the others. One of the vessels which we bonded was in charge of a woman, the wife of the captain who had died at sea. Occasionally, when the weather was fine, we had more prisoners than we could conveniently accommodate on board. We put them astern in whaleboats for the day. On one occasion, we had 24 of these loaded boats towing astern. Our last capture was made on the 28th of June, on which day we took 11 vessels. 9 of them were fired, and were all burning at the same time within a few miles of one another. One of these 11 vessels had been caught in an ice floe, and was so badly injured that our captain had determined to abandon her, preparatory to which there was a sale of all movables on board, which the other vessels had assembled to attend. Most of these were at anchor near the injured vessel, and hence we captured them all with little trouble. The captain of one of these vessels showed fight. He mounted the poop deck of his ship armed with a bomb gun used in killing whales and threatened to fire it into the boat which was about to board him. The officer in charge of the boat, however, disregarded this threat and pulled up to the gangway and went on board with his crew. When the flag was about to be hauled down, another scene of the same sort was enacted. By this time, the boarding party had discovered that the belligerent captain had been celebrating the occasion and was royally drunk. He was taken in charge after some resistance, and refusing to leave his ship, had to be lowered into the boat with a block and tackle. Several of the ships, when they saw what was going on, slipped their cables and steered, some for the shore to get within the Marine League, and some for the ice floes. But, as the wind was light, and we had steam up, we very soon had them all in hand. We were now in Bering Strait, and the next morning entered the Arctic Ocean, where we encountered heavy floes of ice, and the navigation was very dangerous. There was every reason to believe that a number of whalers had passed into the Arctic ahead of us, and I hoped to come up with them. But the captain was afraid to venture very far, the ice being so heavy, and after a day spent in the Arctic, we turned and steered to the southward. On the 5th of July, we passed out of the Bering Sea and into the open Pacific and saw the last of the ice floes. For the next month, nothing occurred to break the monotony of ordinary sea life on the Shenandoah. We were steering to the southward to get into the track of the China traders and the Pacific mail steamers. By the end of the month, we were in the desired cruising ground. On the 2nd of August, we were overhauled and spoke the English bark Barracuda, from whom we received news of the collapse of the Confederate government. While in the Arctic Ocean, we had received on 22nd June from the William Thompson, one of the captured whalers, California papers from April 22nd, giving an account of the assassination of Mr. Lincoln and the evacuation of Richmond, and the surrender of Lee. But the same papers contained the proclamation of Mr. Davis, issued from Danville, saying that the war would be prosecuted with renewed vigor. We had hoped all along that the disaster might not be as bad as the account stated, but the Barracuda had left San Francisco on July 20th, and it was impossible to doubt the correctness of the news she gave us. Yet so strong had been our faith that it seemed incredible to us. The important question now arose as to what was the proper disposition to be made of the Shenandoah. In meeting after parting company with the Barracuda, the guns of the Shenandoah were dismantled and sent below, into the hold for ballast. The portholes, which were of our own construction, were boarded up again, and all the small arms and warlike appearances were stowed away between decks. We kept the ship under sail most of the time, with her propeller up and smokestack reefed, saving the little fuel that remained for condensing fresh water for the use of the ship's company, and for any other emergency that might arise. On the 5th of November, 1865, we reached England, anchored in the Mersey on the morning of the 6th, and the cruise of the Shenandoah ended, the vessel being surrendered to the English authorities. When we took on board the pilot, the first question we asked him was about the war in America, as we had been hoping against hope that there might be some mistake about the news we had received in the Pacific. This called for an amusing cartoon, The Punch, representing the Shenandoah with Captain Waddell astride one of the guns shouting through the huge trumpet to the pilot boat in the distance, "Is Queen Anne dead?" So probably something that we don't necessarily think about is that a Confederate naval raider, and certainly I think I kind of talk about this point often in that, there's no really way to communicate to a raider that's out there at sea. They're going to keep doing what they're doing until they get this news, and we have a paper from the North that is going to be talking about these things and how Lee has surrendered, how the Confederacy is essentially going to be dissolved pretty soon. But you have this conflict between these papers and how sometimes there's some exaggeration. Obviously, you can kind of deduce from that, if you're the members of the Shenandoah, that things are not going well, at the very least. But it might not be as crazy as it sounds, right? So you're not necessarily going to believe that at first, but then once you get additional confirmation, then it's like, all right, well, now it's time to go ahead and surrender. So probably just not something that we necessarily think about. And here we have all the way into November of 1865. That's finally when the Shenandoah is going to be surrendered here at an English port. So I'm going to go ahead and bring things to a close right there. We talked about several different events today. We had the last battle of the Civil War in Palmetto Ranch. We had sort of the conclusion of the Confederate government in the capture of Jefferson Davis. And then finally, we also had the last surrender of the war. We had a couple surrenders that we talked about briefly. And then we had the last surrender of the war of the CSS Shenandoah. That doesn't surrender until November of 1865. So it's kind of wrapping up the end of the Confederacy there. Next week, I think we're going to have a comprehensive look back on the war and kind of go through a couple questions here to really wrap up the narrative. Again, it's very hard to believe we are finally coming to the end of our narrative episodes here. And stay tuned also for an announcement next week on what the future is going to look like. So we will also have that. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.